They built a swimming pool on my land while I was gone, and when I came back I thought I was losing my mind, because the place I had known my entire life had been turned into something I never agreed to, never signed for, and never even got a phone call about. My name is Caleb Mercer, and this happened on Dry Hollow Ranch, 53 acres that have been in my family for 3 generations, land my grandfather broke his back on, when there was nothing out here but dust and mesquite and a wind that never seemed to stop talking. And when I tell you I've seen strange things out here, I mean I've seen droughts that cracked the ground open and storms that swallowed fences whole. But I had never seen anything like what the Silver Pine Meadows HOA did while I was away for just 5 days at a feed and livestock convention down in Dallas. When I left, the south pasture was exactly the way it had always been. Open grass rolling like a green ocean, old cedar fence posts leaning just slightly from years of sun and wind, and the gravel road cutting through it like a memory that refused to fade. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. It was mine, and I trusted it the way you trust something that has never once lied to you. I remember locking the gate behind me, thinking I'd be back before anything even had time to change. And honestly, I was more worried about missing a shipment deal on feed contracts than I was about anything happening at home. But when I pulled back onto the ranch road 5 days later, coffee still half warm in my hand, I saw something that made me slow the truck without even realizing I was pressing the brake, because right there in the middle of my south pasture, sitting where cattle had grazed for decades, was a brand new swimming pool, bright blue water reflecting the sky like it belonged there, surrounded by fresh white concrete, like someone had poured a little piece of suburbia right into the heart of my land. At first my brain refused to process it. I literally sat there thinking maybe I had taken a wrong turn. Maybe I was looking at a neighbor's property. But no, I knew every fence line out here like I knew the lines on my own hand. There were lounge chairs lined up like it was some kind of resort, umbrellas stuck into the ground like flags claiming victory. Even a little metal fence with a keypad gate surrounding the whole thing like they were trying to pretend they had authority over it. And then I saw the sign, shiny brass, freshly mounted, still catching the sun, reading Silver Pine Meadows Community Pool Residents Only, and I just remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd my mind couldn't pick anger fast enough. Residents only. I stood there in my truck longer than I cared to admit, just staring at it, trying to figure out what kind of person builds a pool in the middle of somebody else's pasture and then has the nerve to put a sign on it like it's a public amenity. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. This was a decision made by people who genuinely believed rules didn't apply to land they didn't understand. Silver Pine Meadows HOA had expanded their subdivision about a mile down the road over the last few years. A bunch of new houses, manicured lawns, all the usual stuff, and I had never had issues with them before because I stayed on my side. They stayed on theirs, or at least that's what I thought. But apparently someone on their board decided that the edge of my south pasture, the flattest stretch of ground closest to their development, was the perfect spot for a community pool, and instead of knocking on my door, instead of calling, instead of doing anything that even remotely resembled respect, they just built it. I got out of the truck slowly, boots sinking into the dry grass, and I walked closer because I needed to see if this was real or some kind of cruel joke. And the closer I got, the more details I noticed. The plumbing running under the fence line they had clearly cut and reburied, the fresh tire tracks from heavy equipment, the smell of wet concrete still lingering like it hadn't fully accepted it belonged here either. I stood at the edge of the pool and looked down into that water, and I remember thinking about my grandfather, how he used to say land doesn't forget even when people do. And in that moment, I swear, I felt the whole history of this place pushing back against what I was seeing. I wasn't angry yet, not in the way people expect. I was something quieter, something more dangerous, like my mind was already starting to calculate consequences instead of emotions. That's when I noticed movement near the clubhouse trailer they had parked just beyond the fence. A couple of workers packing up tools like they had finished a job they assumed was approved, and I called out to one of them, asked him simple, direct, who signed off on this, and he shrugged like it wasn't his problem and said HOA board approved it. All permits filed. Everything's good, man. Everything's good. On my land. I just nodded and walked back to my truck because I knew arguing with a contractor wasn't the point. They didn't make the decision. They were just the hands. The decision makers were inside that subdivision, probably sitting around a table drinking coffee, thinking they had just improved the neighborhood. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat on my porch looking out toward the glow of that new pool lighting they had already installed, like they were proud of it, like it was something to show off. And I kept thinking about how easy it must have been for them to redraw the world in their heads where my fence line didn't matter. Around midnight, I got a call from a neighbor 2 miles north, old rancher named Wade Holloway, who had seen trucks coming and going while I was away and thought I already knew. And when I told him I had just gotten back and found a pool sitting in my pasture, there was a long silence on the line. Then he said, "Caleb, you need to handle that fast before they start acting like it belongs to them." And that was the moment something shifted, because up until then I had been trying to understand it, trying to wrap my head around the mistake. But now I understood something simpler. They didn't think it was a mistake at all. The next morning I drove down to the edge of the pool again, this time parked right next to their fancy little gate. And I could already feel the tension building like weather before a storm. And I saw a couple of HOA representatives standing there with clipboards, smiling like they were inspecting their own property. And one of them, a guy in a clean polo shirt with a clipboard tucked under his arm, stepped forward and said, "Morning, sir. We're just finishing up the final inspection for the community pool expansion. Should be open to residents by next week." And I remember looking at him for a second, really looking at him, and asking him slow and calm, "Do you know whose land you're standing on?" And he actually laughed a little like I had made a joke, and said, "According to our survey, this is HOA easement land. So technically it falls under community management." And that's when I felt it. Not anger, but clarity, sharp and cold, because there was no confusion in his voice. He genuinely believed what he was saying, and that meant this wasn't just a construction error. It was a mindset, a whole system of people who had convinced themselves that paperwork could override property lines that had existed longer than their subdivision. I told him my name, Caleb Mercer, Dry Hollow Ranch, and I watched the way his expression changed just slightly, like a flicker of doubt trying to find a way into his confidence. And I said, "You built a pool in my pasture without permission, and I want every document you think gives you the right to be here." And he tightened his grip on that clipboard and said, "We'll have the HOA attorney reach out, sir." And I just nodded because at that point I already knew this wasn't going to end with a conversation, it was going to end with a choice, and I was about to make mine. I didn't go home after that conversation. I just sat in my truck at the edge of that so-called community pool and watched people start to treat it like it had always belonged there. Kids from the subdivision wandering up with towels over their shoulders, parents laughing. Someone even brought a speaker, and music started floating over the water like this was just another Saturday in their world. And the strangest part was how normal it all looked from their side, like nobody had stopped to ask whether any of it was actually legal. They just saw blue water, fresh concrete, and a gate with a lock, and their brains filled in the rest. I kept thinking about what that man in the polo shirt said, HOA easement land, like those words had magic in them. Like saying them could erase 53 acres of history and fence lines and blood and sweat and make it all public property in one stroke of a pen. Around mid-morning, I finally drove up to the subdivision office building, a little glass structure with a stone sign that said Silver Pine Meadows HOA Community Services, and I could already feel the difference in air as I crossed from ranch land into their world, everything trimmed, everything measured, everything pretending to be permanent. Inside there was a receptionist who smiled too quickly when I said I needed to speak to whoever approved construction on my property, and she asked me to wait like this was a dentist appointment, not a legal trespass. 10 minutes later, a man walked out who introduced himself as Gregory Hale, HOA president, late 40s, perfect tan like he paid for it, and the kind of confident smile that tells you he's used to people backing down before they finish their sentence. He didn't even offer me a seat, just leaned against the counter and said, "I understand there's been some confusion about the pool project," and I told him there was no confusion, only trespass, and he actually chuckled a little like I was being dramatic. He said, "Caleb, right, we pulled county maps. There's a historical easement along that corridor. It's standard expansion protocol when we improve community amenities." And I remember just staring at him, because the more he spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't ignorance. It was confidence built on assumption, the kind that comes from never being seriously challenged. I asked him when exactly did my signature appear on any of those documents, and he shrugged and said sometimes easements are grandfathered in. Sometimes land boundaries are misrepresented on outdated surveys. But don't worry, we can compensate you if this is about value. And that word compensate hit me harder than I expected, because it turned my family land into a negotiable inconvenience in his mind. I leaned forward and said, "Gregory, You built a pool inside my pasture without permission, and you're telling me it's a misunderstanding." And for the first time, his smile tightened just a little, not gone, just thinner. And he said, "We're not trying to escalate this, but you have to understand the HOA has authority to improve shared infrastructure." And I interrupted him and said, "Shared means everyone, not just the people behind your gate." That's when another man stepped out from a side office, the HOA attorney, already holding a folder like he had been expecting this moment for days. And he started talking about liability, jurisdiction, survey disputes, county approvals, all the language people use when they want to make something simple sound complicated enough to exhaust you into silence. I didn't argue much. I just listened, because I realized something important sitting there under their fluorescent lights. They weren't going to admit wrongdoing easily, not because they were right, but because they had already invested money, time, and pride into being wrong. Before I left, I told them one thing, clearly, calmly, almost politely. I said, "You have built on my land. I am documenting everything, and whatever happens next will not be a conversation. It will be a record." And I saw a flicker of annoyance in Gregory's eyes, like I had just become less cooperative than he preferred. I drove back to the ranch, and that's when I started filming everything: drone footage, ground shots, fence lines, equipment marks, even the way the pool plumbing crossed my property boundary. And I sent copies to Wade and a couple of other ranchers who had dealt with HOA disputes before, and every single one of them said the same thing: "Don't wait. They will try to normalize it if you give them time." By the next day, the pool was fully active, and that's when I made my decision. Because if they were going to treat my land like a public amenity, then I was going to remind them what the land actually supported. I loaded up my cattle trailer that morning, 27 head, calm as ever, and I didn't announce anything to anyone. I just opened the south pasture gate like I had done 1,000 times before, except this time I aimed straight toward that brand new fence they had installed around the pool. I remember sitting in the cab for a moment before I moved, listening to the cattle shifting in the trailer, heavy breathing, metal creaking, that familiar sound that usually meant work, not war. And I said out loud to myself something like, "All right, girls, let's go for a walk." And I swear there was something almost absurdly peaceful about it, like I was returning balance to something that had been tilted. I backed the trailer right up to their gate, and for a second I saw movement inside the pool area, someone pointing, someone shouting, but I didn't rush. I just opened the gate slow, let the ramp drop, and then I whistled once. The first cow stepped out, then another, and within seconds the whole herd was moving forward like they were heading into water they had known their entire lives. Except this water had never seen anything like them. At first people laughed. I think they thought it was some kind of ranch demonstration or a mistake that could be corrected. But then the first cow stepped right into the shallow end of the pool, and that laughter disappeared in real time. The water changed immediately, ripples turning into chaos, umbrellas tipping, chairs sliding, concrete suddenly becoming something very different under weight and hooves. And I just stood there watching like I was observing weather form. One of the HOA board members came running out shouting, "Stop, stop, you can't do this." And I finally raised my voice just enough to carry and said, "You built this on my land. What exactly did you think was going to happen?" And he looked at me like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words fast enough, because the reality of 27 cattle in a swimming pool does not leave much room for debate. Gregory showed up a minute later, face already red, trying to act in control but failing at the edges, yelling that I was destroying community property. And I remember laughing once because that sentence sounded so clean compared to what I was looking at. And I told him calmly, "Gregory, that's not community property. That's a pool you built on my pasture, and now it's a stock tank until further notice." By evening, the transformation was complete in the worst way for them and the most natural way for me. The water was murky, the decking was scattered with mud. The smell of livestock had replaced whatever chemical resort fantasy they had poured into it, and my cattle had already settled like they had always belonged there. I didn't feel rage at that point. I felt something closer to correction, like the land had finally spoken in a language they could understand. That night the phone calls started again, but louder this time. HOA attorney, county office, even someone claiming to represent insurance, all demanding removal, all insisting urgency. And I told them the same thing every time: this is documented trespass. Resolve it through proper legal channels. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, I sat on my porch again, watching the glow from the pool lights flicker through trees, and I thought about how quickly people confuse construction with ownership. By the third morning, everything had shifted from confusion to full-scale conflict, not on my side but on theirs. Because once the photos and drone footage started circulating beyond the subdivision, the story stopped being about a rancher and a pool and became something larger, something uncomfortable for the people who signed off on it. And I started getting calls from numbers I didn't recognize, local reporters first, then a regional station asking if it was true that an HOA had constructed a recreational facility on private agricultural land without consent. And I didn't add anything dramatic. I just sent them the footage and said, "You can come look for yourself." Within 48 hours, there were cameras at the fence line, trucks parked along the gravel road, and people standing where my cattle had been grazing their entire lives, trying to understand how something like this could happen in plain daylight without anyone stopping it. Gregory Hale was no longer smiling in interviews. He was carefully choosing words like misunderstanding and survey discrepancy. But the problem with recordings is they don't care about tone. They care about facts. And the facts were simple enough that even lawyers couldn't dress them up forever. A pool had been built, concrete poured, plumbing installed, fencing secured, all inside a boundary that had been in county records longer than the subdivision itself. The county finally sent an inspector, an older woman who walked the perimeter twice without saying much, just taking notes, occasionally looking back at the pool like she was trying to decide whether she was looking at arrogance or incompetence. And when she finished, she didn't argue. She just said the words that changed everything. Unauthorized construction on private land. Stop work order pending review. That phrase hit the HOA harder than anything I could have done myself, because suddenly the pool wasn't an amenity anymore. It was a liability sitting in the middle of someone else's pasture. Gregory showed up at my property that afternoon. No clipboard this time. No confident posture. Just a man trying to recover control of a situation that had already slipped past him. And he asked if we could talk like reasonable adults, and I told him we already had. The problem was he only liked the part where I was supposed to agree with him. He said the HOA was willing to restore the land, remove the pool, repair fencing, compensate damages, and I remember standing there looking past him at the cattle moving slowly through what used to be their swimming pool, and I said something simple, no anger, just clarity. You don't restore something you never had the right to touch. That's when the attorney stepped in again. This time more careful, almost cautious, and he laid out options like a negotiation instead of a correction, but I interrupted him and told him I wasn't interested in undoing history. I was interested in recognizing ownership, and that was the moment everything changed because they realized I wasn't asking for revenge or cleanup. I was asking for control of the outcome. 2 weeks later, the HOA returned with a formal proposal. And this is where most people expected me to demand they tear everything down and leave the land exactly as it was. But land doesn't forget disturbance that easily. And I knew that tearing it out wouldn't undo the fact that they had already treated it like it belonged to them. So I made a different offer, one that none of them expected. They could keep the pool structure, maintain it, operate it, even continue using it as a community facility, but only under a lease agreement for the land itself. $10,000 a month. Legally binding, enforceable, non-negotiable. The room went silent when I said it, not because it was aggressive, but because it reframed everything. Suddenly, the pool wasn't a mistake that needed forgiveness. It was an asset sitting on rented ground. Gregory tried to argue about valuation, about fairness, about precedent, but I stopped him halfway through and said, "You already set the precedent when you built on my property without asking." The attorney pulled him aside. They talked for maybe 20 minutes, and when they came back, the energy was completely different. Not proud, not defeated, just practical, like people signing paperwork on something they should have never started. They agreed. Every page, every clause, every condition. And when the ink dried, something strange happened. The anger I expected to feel never really came, because what replaced it wasn't satisfaction and destruction. It was something quieter, more final, like balance restored through structure instead of force. Summer came and went, and the pool stayed open. Families still used it, kids still laughed there, but now every sign of enjoyment sat on top of something they couldn't ignore. The fact that the land beneath it belonged to someone who had every legal right to shut it down at any moment. Sometimes I drive past it in the evenings when the light hits the water just right, and it almost looks peaceful again. Almost. And I think about how easily people confuse access with ownership, convenience with permission, and confidence with authority. Gregory doesn't smile anymore when I see him, just nods, like someone who learned the difference the expensive way. And the truth is I didn't ruin anything that day I brought my cattle in. I just revealed what was already wrong underneath it. So now I'll leave you with this. If you were in my position, would you have torn it all down or done exactly what I did and turned it into something that pays you back every single month? Because I still hear people argue about it even now. And I'm curious where you stand on it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone.